Building the South Africa we want starts now, and it's a process that should involve all of us. It starts with concrete actions that address both the challenges of the present and lay the foundation for the next 5 years, the next decade, and beyond.
Well, that's the conversation we're talking about today. Corruption Watch says although corruption affects us all, it is the poorest in our communities who are affected because public policies and public resources are largely meant for their benefit. Multiple commissions, including the Justice Zondo Commission, have somewhat revealed the scale of corruption to the nation, uncovering the blurred lines between proper governance and the separation of powers between government and politicians in the management of public institutions. This week, the Auditor General released the 2019 report that indicates that only 18 out of more than 250 municipalities had their finances in order, again reflecting impropriety in the manner in which these municipalities are managed. So we're asking you on the show today, what will it take for our economy to recover from the effects of years of corruption? And can our economy recover? To talk to us more about this, we joined in the studio by Cedric Bila, he's Business Development Manager at 10X Investments, and Cynthia Stimple, who is a whistleblower. And on the line, we're joined by David Lewis, the Executive Director at Corruption Watch. A very good evening to you, David. Let's start with you, perhaps with just a clarification of separating public and private corruption. And just recently, Corruption Watch was back at the courts defending its activism around the Auditor Commission findings. Tell us more about that in relation to the broader conversation about corruption in South Africa.
Well, the Auditor Commission matter that we were in court about was to ask the court to review and set aside the findings of the Auditor Commission. The Auditor Commission was the investigation into the iconic arms deal of some 25 years ago. And the Commission of Inquiry that was set up to investigate it found that there was no corruption. We think that they found that there was no corruption because they didn't do a proper investigation. And on that basis, we've asked the court to set aside the findings of the Auditor Commission, which means that nobody, including the former President Zuma, are going to be able to claim to have been exonerated by the findings of the Commission. We also hope that the court will lay down the method that has to be followed, the process that has to be followed when judicial commissions of inquiry are charged with doing investigations of this sort. But, for the rest, the public and private sector, most corruption happens at the interface between the public and the private. If it's a private individual and a traffic officer, or if it's a head of procurement in a big state-owned enterprise and the CEO of a big company wanting to sell some product or service, it mostly happens at the interface between the public and the private. But there are pure private players, if you like. Steinhoff, given the impact it's had on pension funds particularly, is a clear case of corruption and once again affecting the people least able to protect themselves.
And I suppose that's the bigger conversation there, that there are always impacts, even though there are individuals or groups that think that they benefit from corruption.
Yeah, there are always victims. Some people misguidedly think that corruption is an offence that has no victims. The victims, corruption is traditionally defined as the abuse of trust and the abuse of public resources for private gain. That doesn't mean that private individuals don't abuse it, but what it does mean is that those who rely on public resources, public transport, public health, public education, public security, public housing, are the ones who bear the brunt of corruption. Those who have private medical aids, who have private security guards, who send their kids to private schools, they are relatively well protected from the effects of corruption, and it's always the people least able to afford it who have to deal with the brunt of corruption. Those who have private generators are immunized to a significant extent from what is happening in Eskom, which is in significant part a consequence of corruption. So if you have private resources, you're generally well protected from the effects of corruption, or much better protected from the effects of corruption than if you rely on public services and public goods.
Cedric, of course, when we talk about corruption, some of the enablers of this are people we consider to be professionals. How is this impacting on the corporate space that people who are meant to know better engage in these activities?
It's quite a negative impact, because you consider what the private sector is to South Africans in our economy. And if you consider that people would ordinarily just give their resources to the private sector to safekeep and safeguard, and there's a huge reputational risk, and there's a huge risk of people not having the trust anymore in the private sector, in organizations and businesses that are supposed to stand up for what they believe in, because the people that are affected the most are also customers and clients of the private sector. Without them, the private sector wouldn't exist. We are family, friends of those who are affected the most. And if we want to create an economy for all South Africans, an economy that thrives, we also need to protect the interests of those who rely heavily on the public sector as the private sector ourselves.
You're watching Unfiltered. Today's show is a bit shortened because of the AFCON action. When we come back from this break, we'll talk to Cynthia Stimple. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're watching Unfiltered, and thanks for taking part in our conversation on social media. We're talking about corruption today. Let's bring in Cynthia Stimple. You're bringing in a different perspective, that of whistleblowers. You were at SAA, and there was a seemingly irregular transaction that was about to go underway. And tell us about your story.
Thank you very much. So in my role at the time of working at SAA, I was the group treasurer, and our role as the treasury team was sourcing funds for SAA. And during the tenure that I was there, and the reason why I whistleblew was that there was a bid done for a transaction advisor who mainly had a mandate to do 4 things: look at our balance sheet, restructure it, look at our expensive debt and how we were managing it, and whether we could sort of repay sooner, etc. The other was looking at our fleet and how we could manage the aircraft around the fleet. And the fourth one was basically restructuring balance sheet. But then the client won that award, and the company then decided, without going out an RFP and sending it out, to increase the scope, to source funding, and from an original fee of 2.6 million to pay this client 256 million. And obviously they brought it for my signature, and I said, I'm not prepared to sign this. Yeah. And obviously through investigations further found that this was not a kosher, regular deal, and based on that, I whistleblew. Yes.
Transaction advisors have been a big topic at the Zondo Commission in relation to Transnet, in relation to SAA. What are your thoughts as you watch the processes unfolding there?
That I see that they're using this as a mechanism to filter funds away. So you normally, if I talk of the BNP deal, for instance, we as Treasury sourced the funds, and we sourced them directly from the main bankers who had the capability and capacity.
So you were essentially working for a third party and not for SAA, in a way?
No, if they got the third party, yes, the third party would have got the funds. Yes, exactly. And so what I've seen in Transnet, Eskom, SAA, now all those corporations, is that they're using a middleman. So the staff can already do it. There's already mechanisms in place, systems in place, procedures in place to do that work. But then they create this or source another company to do that work, but their fees are exorbitant, and that's a way of getting money out of the companies.
Has it been worth it?
Worth it for
being a whistleblower?
Yes, definitely.
Because that's the big question that other people out there watching who want to expose irregular dealings feel, we're going to be victimized from here on.
You're definitely victimized. You're definitely on your own. It's a lonely place to be at. You start self-doubting when you've done it. But when your conscience, your moral compass, your value system, when you look at that and you say, no, it was the right thing to do. I can put my head on a pillow at night and know I did the right thing. So for me, yes, it was worth it. Yes, there's been pain. And I know, speaking to other whistleblowers, they've suffered casualties. There's many across this country.
Especially in terms of family life.
From family life, loss of financial income. Loss of credibility in some cases, some loss of although when you listen to this story with hindsight, we need to literally understand where they've come from. So yes, there are many challenges still. I think in our country, we haven't accepted whistleblowers. We haven't, the Protected Disclosures Act is really not working. I did some research and found that almost a handful have been protected through the Protected Disclosures Act, but not many have. Many have lost their jobs and literally have to find other means of income, and at a reduced, they won't get the same income that they were, so earning probably a third or a fourth or an eighth, and suffering through family relationships, through financial loss and many other things.
David, the work of Corruption Watch is about identifying and uncovering, exposing corruption, and you've gone to the court several times in trying to carry out your work. Do you feel like the legal framework is supporting your work?
Yeah, our legal framework is, pretty much, up to, some of the best standards in the world. I mean, there are some frameworks that are vulnerable to corruption. The mining licensing situation is very vulnerable to corruption. Our procurement system could be tightened up, but the problem is not so much the legal framework as the enforcement of that, of the regulations. And among the first institutions to be captured in the whole state capture period were institutions like the NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority, the Hawks, later SARS. Parliament was an institution that never exercised its duty of oversight of holding the executive to account. And it was the failure at those levels, rather than at the level of the formal legal framework, that has let us down over the last decade. So, yes, parts of our legal framework can be tightened up, but more than that, it's political will, it's getting the authorities of accountability, the institutions of accountability onto a decent footing again. And principal amongst those are SARS, the NPA, the Hawks, crime intelligence. Those are the institutions. SARS. Those are the institutions that one needs to strengthen in order to give effect to the legal framework.
And that's on the government or the public side. But Cedric Bila, on the corporate side, what is the role of professional bodies in holding people in leadership to account?
It's a very big role and an important one. If you consider the fact that as professionals, you come into an industry backed by a certification that you have achieved through one of these professional bodies, it remains the responsibility of even them to speak out against corruption. If you consider that private sector and the business sector is pretty much the economic muscle of many South Africans. And unlike Cynthia, who's an individual and stands to lose a lot, the private organizations such as professional bodies, they're the ones that are seen as leaders. If they're quiet about the things that go on in the private sector, what confidence does it give to ordinary professionals who will want to blow the whistle but aren't certain that their professional body is going to back them all the way? what certainty will there be that if they want to take up the ethical standard of their professional body and speak out against corruption, even in their own profession, that the professional body won't help? So it's an important role that they need to play in this.
Cynthia, in the limited time we have, what conversations should professionals be having about ethical behavior and doing the things that they promise their target markets to deliver correctly?
So let's start with going on to the professional body. So you have like your SAICA, URBA, Institute of Directors. Most of those professionals belong to some sort of body, and it's for them to aspire to those code of conducts and need to be held accountable for it. That's the first step, I would say. In your own work sphere, where you are, no matter which company you are, be it private, be it government, is
when no one is watching.
When no one is watching, be ethical. You know, it's that personal moral code that you have as an individual is how we conduct ourselves, and always aspire to that. Once you can do that, it affects how you behave in a society and how you behave in a community. And if we conduct ourselves from an ethical and a true moral compass, the rest follows. It's if you're trying to always find alternate ways and not be truthful, honest, not take what is not yours, that culture can stop. And that's why I believe it starts with each one of us, and we need to hold ourselves accountable.
David, the very latest has been at the National Assembly, where we've seen chairpersons of different portfolio committees being appointed with a questionable past. What is Corruption Watch's response to this?
Well, we were appalled at the appointment of people like Supra Mahumapela, Zwane, Mospenzi Zwane, Bongo. These are people with very, very dark clouds hanging over them. And I hope that the law takes its course with respect to all of them. But it really is a blot on the name of the governing party that has placed them in Parliament to begin with, on the parliamentary list to begin with, let alone appointed them to be chairs of important committees of Parliament. It really is a travesty, and it doesn't make one optimistic that Parliament will play the role that it should have been playing, and that to some extent in the last year or so of the Zuma administration and at the beginning of the Ramaphosa administration, there were signs of Parliament finding its spine and playing its proper oversight and accountability role. But, you know, what has happened now with the composition of the new Parliament doesn't fill one with confidence, I have to say.
David, that's all the time we have tonight. Thanks for making the time to talk to us. David Lewis is the Executive Director at Corruption Watch. Cynthia, what are you doing these days?
Well, I teach yoga to adults and to children. I'm also on the board of Amnesty International, and on the board of...
We spoke to Kumi recently.
Oh, good.
Yes.
And I'm on the board of the Johannesburg Children's Home, and I do lots of volunteer work in between. Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for making the time as well to come through to talk to us. Mr. Pila, your closing shots?
Well, my closing shots, I think, when we think about corruption, I'm sure many of us have heard the analogy that corruption is like a cancer in our society, but I beg to differ. Corruption is not like cancer. Cancer people get from unfortunate chance, whereas corruption, it takes an option and a choice to do it. Cancer is about curing the disease and saving the patient. With corruption, let's cure the mess that corruption has done, but let's kill the patient. Let's make sure that people get prosecuted. And lastly, cancer isn't contagious, but a culture of corruption is. We need to watch out for that as South Africans.
Cedric Pila, also thank you for your contribution. And before we get to the end of the show, let's just take a look at the results of a poll we were running tonight, asking you, can our economy recover from the effects of years of corruption? 34% of you are optimistic, 41% say not really, and 25% is a maybe. That's all we had for you. Let's continue this conversation on our social media platforms. I'm Desiree Chauke. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.